Happy holidays, my friends, and welcome back to another season of Merry Scary Christmas. If you have not joined us before, this is another segment of the show where I read more scary stories, this time from stories from the Victorian era. You're thinking scary stories at Christmas. Well, if you think of the song The Most Wonderful Time of the Year, most famously known from the Andy Williams rendition, if you think of the line, "We tell scary ghost stories and tales of the glories of Christmases long, long ago." That was a part of the tradition back in the Victorian era. They would share scary stories around a campfire, around their hearths, and in the back of their coaches and wagons as they would go out to barn dances and parties in their community. It was a part of their entertainment. And as time grew on, this fell out of favor. So this book is specifically written about those stories that were shared. This is called Victorian Christmas Stories. It's 13 ghost stories to read on a dark, snowy night. And there is no author that I know of that wrote this book, but each individual story has its author. And the story we are going to be reading right now is called The Kit Bag by Algernon Blackwood. Let me show you the picture, the front cover of the book. This one I read a few years ago. So I think we are on season 3 now of this wonderful new tradition. So let's go ahead and get started. The Kit Bag. This took place in 1908. When the words "not guilty" sounded through the crowded courtroom that dark December afternoon, Arthur Wilderbaum, the great criminal KC and leader of the triumphant defense, was represented by his junior, but Johnson, his private secretary, called the verdict across the chamber like lightning. It was they're getting into old English here. "It's what we expected, I think," said the barrister, meaning attorney, without emotion. "And personally, I am glad that the case is over." There was no particular sign or pleasure that his defense of John Turk, the murderer, on a plea of insanity had been successful, or no doubt that he felt, as somebody who had walked in the case, felt that no man had ever better deserved the gallows. "I am too," said Johnson. He had sat down in the court for 10 days watching the face of the man who had carried out the callous details detail of one of the most brutal and cold-blooded murders of recent years. But counsel glanced up at the secretary. They were more than employer and employee, and more than employer and employed. For family and other reasons, they were friends. Ah, I remember. Yes, he said with a kind smile. And you want to get away for Christmas. You're going to skate and ski in the Alps, aren't you? If I was your age, I'd come with you. Johnson laughed shortly. He was a young man of 26, with a delicate face like a girl's. I can catch the morning boat now, he said. But that's not the reason I'm glad the trial is over. I'm glad it's over because I've seen the last of this man's dreadful face. It positively has haunted me. But bat white skin with dark hair brushed low over his forehead is a thing I shall never forget. And the description of the way is he dismembered the body and crammed it and packed it with lime. At that, please forgive me, I have a little bit of dyslexia for those of you who are just joining this channel. Don't dwell on it, my dear fellow, interrupted another, looking at him curiously without his keen eyes. Don't think about it. Such pictures have a trick of coming back when you least want them. He paused a moment. Now go, he added pleasantly, and empty your holiday, and enjoy your holiday. I shall want your energy for my parliamentary work when you go back, and don't break your neck skiing. Famous last words, huh? Johnson shook his head and took his leave at the door. At the door, he turned suddenly. I knew there was something I wanted to ask you, he said. Would you mind lending me one of your kit bags? It's too late to get one tonight, and I have to leave in the morning before the shops are open. Well, of course, I'll send Henry over with it to your rooms, and you shall have it in a moment I get home. I promise to take good care of it, said Johnson gratefully, delighted to think that within 30 hours he will be nearing the brilliant sunshine of the high Alps in winter. He thought of that criminal court was like an evil dream in his mind. He drew at the curb and went onto a Bloomsbury, where he occupied the top floor in one of those old gaunt houses in which the rooms were large and lofty, and the floor below his own was vacant and unfurnished, and below there were other lodgers which had come not to know, and it was cheerless, and he looked forward wholeheartedly to the change. The night has come more cheerless. It was mistakable that a few people were about. A cold, sleety rain was driving down the streets before the keenest east wind had ever felt. It howled dismally among the big gloomy houses in the great squares, and when he reached his room he heard a whistling and shouting over the wind and of the black roofs beyond his windows. And in the hall he met the landlady, shading the candle in front from the drafts with her hand, and came to the man and said, Mr. Wilbraham, sir." She pointed out what was evidently a big kid, and Johnson thanked her and took it upstairs to him. "I shall be going abroad in the morning for 10 days, Mrs. Monks," he said. "I'll leave an address and I will have an address for some letters. And hope you will have the Merry Christmas, sir," she said, in a precocious, wheezy voice. She suggested spirits in better weather than this. "I hope so too," replied her lodger, shuddering a little as the wind went roaring down the street outside. And he got upstairs and he heard the sleet volleying against the window panes, and he put his kettle on to make a cup of hot coffee, and then he sat down and putting on the things in order for his absence, and knew I must pack. Such my packing is, he laughed to himself, and sat down to his work at once. He pulled the packing from it, and he knew the mountains were so vividly before him, made him forget the unpleasant scene in the past 10 years. Before, it was not deliberate in nature. His friends had lent him the very thing, a stout canvas bag, sack-shaped, with holes round the neck and breast near the padlock. It was big and shapeless, true, and not more to look at than but its capacity was unlimited, and there was no need to pack everything carefully. He shoved it in his waterproof coat and his fur cap and gloves, his skating boots, and his skates and climbing boots, pardon me, sweaters, snow boots, and ear caps. And then the top of these he piled his woolen shirts, underwear, his thick socks, puttees, and knickerbockers, and the dress suit came next. In the case the hotel people dressed for dinner. And then the best way to pack his winter shirts, he paused for a moment to reflect. Bats, the worst of these kit bats. He mused vaguely. He turned to the center of the sitting room where he had come to fetch something. It was after 10 o'clock, and the furious gust of the wind rattled at the windows as though to hurry him up, and he threw his pity and poor Londoners, whose Christmas would be spent in the middle of the climate, whilst he was skiing over the snowy slopes. It brought sunshine and dancing in every way with his rosy-cheeked girls. That reminded him. He must have put on his dancing pumps and socks. He crossed over from his sitting room on the cupboard on the landing, where he kept his linen. And there, and as he did so, he heard someone coming softly up the stairs. He stood for a moment on the landing to learn that it was Mrs. Monk's step. He thought she must be coming up with the post, but then the steps ceased, and suddenly he heard no more, and there, at least 2 flights down, he came to the conclusion they were too heavy to be those of a dubious landlady. No doubt they belonged to a late lodger who had mistaken his floor. And he went down to his bedroom and packed his pumps and dress shirts as best as he could. His kit bag by the time was 2/3 full and stood upright on its own. Base was like a sack of flour, and the first time he noticed that it was old and dirty, and the canvas faded and worn, and he had obviously been subject to weather rather than treatment. It was not a very nice thing to have sent him, certainly not a new one, nor that his chief valued. He gave the matter a passing thought. And he went on with his packing. Once or twice, however, he caught himself wondering who could have been wandering down the stairs below him. Mrs. Monk had not come up with letters, and the few empty furnishings from time to time. However, he was almost certain he heard a soft tread of someone padding about and overheard boards cautiously, stealthily, and silently as possible. And further, the souls had been lately coming distinctly nearer. For the first time in his life, he began to feel a little creepy. Then he thought to emphasize the feeling of an odd thing happening as he felt the bedroom, having just packed his recalcitrant white shirt. He noticed that the top of the kit bag lopped over towards him with an extraordinary resemblance of a human face, but Camus fell into the floor like a nose of the forehead, and the brass rings of the padlocks had just filled the position of the eyes. A shadow, or was it a travel stain? He could not tell. He could not tell exactly, looking like hair. Sounds like a case of pareidolia. It gave him rather turn, for it was so absurd and so outrageous, like the face of John Turk, the murderer. He laughed and went to the front room, and where the light was stronger. That horrid case has got to his mind, he thought. I shall be glad of a change of scene and air. And in the sitting room, however, he was not pleasant to hear again the stealthy tread up the stairs, and realized that it was much closer than before, and he was unmistakably real. And this time he got up and went to see who could be creeping upon the upper staircase this late of an hour, but stood across. There was no one visible on the stairs. He went to the floor, but not without trepidation, and turned to the electric light to make sure that no one was hiding in the empty rooms of an unoccupied suite. There was not a stick of furniture large enough to hide a dog. Then he called over the banister to Mrs. Monk's, but there was no answer, and the voice echoed down into the dark vault of the house and was lost in the roar of the gale of the howl outside. However, everyone was in the bedroom, asleep, everyone except himself and the owner of the soft, stealthy tread. My absurd imagination, I suppose, he thought. It must have been the wind. After all, it seemed to be very real and close, I thought. He went back to his packing. It was by this time getting on towards midnight. He drank his coffee and lit another pipe, the last before turning in. And before I say exactly at what point fear begins, when the cause of fear, or not plainly before the eyes, the impression, rather on the surface of the mind, film by film, or ice gathers upon the surface of still water, but often, slightly, they claim to be different recognition from the conscious. Then a point is reached where the acclamation impressions become a definite emotion, and the mind realizes that something has happened. With something of a start, John suddenly recognized that he had felt nervous, oddly nervous also. For some time, the case of what he is feeling had been gathered slowly in his mind, and that he had only just reached the point where he was forced to acknowledge them. It was struggling. It was a singular and curious malaise that had come over him, and hardly knew what to make of it. He felt as though it were going down. He felt as though it were doing something that was strongly objected to be another person more who had some right of an object. It was something disturbing and distinguishable feeling, but unlike the persistent promptings of conscience, almost in fact as though it were doing something he knew to be wrong. Yet he reached a vigorous and honesty in mind. He could nowhere lay his finger upon the secret of his growing unconscious, and it perplexed him. More, it distressed him and frightened him. Pure nerves, I suppose, he said aloud with a forced laugh. Mountain air will cure all of that, he added. Still, something to him in that reminds me, my snow glasses. He stumbled to the door of the bedroom during this brief soliloquy as he passed quickly towards the middle of the room and stretched forth from the cupboard, and he saw in the corner of his eyes a distinct outline of a figure standing in the stairs. We've all experienced that from time to time, haven't we? A few feet from the top, it was something in a stooping position with one hand on the banister and the face peering out towards him, towards the landing. And in the same moment, he heard shuffling footsteps. The person who had been creeping below all this time had at last come up to his own floor. Who in the world could it be? What is the name what in the name of heaven did he want? Johnson thought. He breathed sharply. And stood stock still. Then, after a few moments of hesitation, he found his courage. He turned to investigate. Stairs he saw, to his utter amazement, were empty, but there was no one. He felt a series of cold shivers run over him, and something was about to muscle on his legs and give them a legs, and gave a little and grew weak. For the space of several minutes, he peered quickly on the shadow, and then congregated about the top of the staircase when he had seen the figure, and then he walked fast, almost ran, in fact, into the light of the front room. Hardly had he passed inside the door when he heard someone come up the stairs behind him, and with a quick bound, and go softly into the bedroom. It was heavy, but at the same time the stealthy footsteps treaded of somebody who did not wish to be seen, and it was precise at that precise moment when the nervousness he had hitherto experienced leaped to the boundary line and entered a state of fear, almost of acute unreasoning, before it turned into terror with a further boundary to cross, and beyond that again lay region of pure horror. Johnson's position was an inevitable one. By Jove! This was someone on the stairs. Then he muted. His face crawled all over. Whatever it was, now gone into his room, his delicate pale face turned obviously white, and no one, for some minutes, he hardly knew what to think or do, but then he realized intuitively the delay only set a premium upon his fear. He crossed the landing boldly and went straight into the room where a few seconds before the steps had disappeared. "Who's there? Is that you, Mrs. Monks?" he called aloud as he went, and heard the first half of the words echo down the empty stairs, while the second half dead against the curtains in the room, and apparently held no other human figure in the room. "Who's there?" he called again, in a voice unnecessarily loud and only just held firm. "What do you want here?" The curtain swayed very slightly, and then he saw it. His heart felt as though it had missed a beat. Yet he dashed forward and drew them aside with a rush. A window streamed with rain, and all that met his gaze. He continued his search, but in vain. The cupboards had nothing but rows of dishes hanging motionless under the bed, with no sign of anyone holding a few backwards, with anyone hiding. He stepped backwards in the middle of the room, and as he did so, something all but tripped him. Turning, he with a sudden spring of alarm, he saw it, the kit bag. Odd, he thought. That's not where I left it. A few moments ago, it had suddenly been on his right. Now, between the bed and the bath. But he did not remember having moved it. It was very curious, but what in the world was the matter with everything? Were all of his senses gone queer? Therefore, the gust of wind tore into the windows, dashing the sleet against the glass, and forced the small gunshot, and then fled howling dismally over the wastes of the Bloomsbury roofs. A sudden vision of the Channel next day rose in his mind, and recalled him sharply to realities. There was no one here, at any rate. That's quite clear, he exclaimed aloud. Yet, at the time he uttered them, he knew perfectly well that his windows were not true, and that he did not believe himself. He felt exactly as though someone were hiding close to him, watching his movements, trying to hinder his packing in some way. All two of my scenes are at it, he added, keeping up the pretense, have played me the most absurd tricks. The steps I heard and the figure I saw were beneath entirely imaginary. He kept back in the front room, poked the fire into a blaze, and he sat down before it to think. What impressed him more than anything else was the fact that the kit was no longer where it had been, and it had been dragged nearer to the door. What happened afterwards that night happened, of course, to a man already excited by fear, and it was perceiving by mind, and not the full proper control, therefore, of the scenes. Otherwise, Johnson remained calm and master of himself to the end, pretending to be the very last that everything he witnessed by a natural explanation or a mere delusion of his tired nerves. He inwardly, in his very heart, he knew that along with that someone had been hiding themselves downstairs in an empty suite. When he came in, that person had watched his opportunity and then stealthily made his way up into the bedroom, and that all he saw and heard afterwards, from the moving of the ski kit bag all too well to the other things the story has to tell, were caused directly by the presence of this invisible person. And it was here, just when he most desired to keep his mind and thoughts controlled by the vivid pictures received day after day, after the mental plates exposed in the courtroom of the old lady came strongly to the light and development themselves in the dark room of his inner vision, pleasant haunting memories having a way of coming to life again just when the mind last desires them, and the silent watches of the night on the sleepless pillows during the lonely hours spent by sick and dying beds. And now, in the same way, Johnson saw nothing but the dreadful face of John Turk, the murderer, lowering at him from every corner of his mental field of vision. The white skin, the evil eyes, the fringe of black hair lowered over his forehead, and the pictures of those 10 days in court crowded back into the mind of the unbidden and the very vivid. This is all rubbish. And nerves, he exclaimed at length, springing with sudden energy in his chair. I shall finish my packing and go to bed. I'm overthought, overtired, he doubted, and at this rate I shall never hear steps and things at all tonight. In his face was deadly and white at the same time. He snatched up his field glasses and walked across the bedroom, humming a music hall song as he went a trifle too loud to be natural. In an instant he crossed the threshold and stood in the room, and something turned cold in his heart, and he felt every hair on his head stood up. The kit bag lay close in front of him, several feet nearer to the door than where he had left it. Just over his crumpled top, he saw a head and face slowly shrinking down out of sight. Someone were crouching behind him in the dark, and at that moment, sound like a long-drawn sigh was distinctly audible, still in air with him between the gusts of the storm outside. Johnson had more courage and willpower than the girlish indecision of his face indicated, but at first such a wave of terror came over him. For some seconds he do nothing but stand and stare. A violent trembling ran down his back and legs, and he was conscious and fooling, almost hysterical, impulses of screams aloud. He thought he screams aloud. That sigh seemed in his very ear, the air still quivering in it. It was an unmistakable human sigh. "Oh, who's there?" he said at length, finding in his voice he thought he meant to speak with loud decisions, and the tones came out instead of a faint whisper, for he had partially lost the control of his tongue and lips. He dropped forward so that he could not he dropped forward so that he could see all around and over the kit bag. And of course, there was nothing there, nothing but the faded carpet and bulging canvas kit, the bulging canvas bag. He put out his hands and threw them up over his mouth, threw them up over the mouth of the sack. It had fallen together, being only 3 parts full. There he saw for the first time that round the inside, some 6 inches from the top, there ran a broad smear of dull crimson. Things are starting to come together now, aren't they, ladies and gentlemen? It was an old and faded blood stain. Oh, I lost my part. Hold on. Old and faded. He uttered a scream and drew back his hands as though they were hurt. In the same moment, the kit bag gave a faint but unmistakable lurch forward towards the door. Johnson collapsed backwards, searching with his hands for the support of something solid, but the door being further behind him than he realized, received his weight just in time to prevent him from falling and shut to. With a resounding bang, and the sound, in the same moment, the swinging of his arm accidentally touched the electric switch and the lights went out. Oh, this was the 1600s, so it was the little round switches, or the knob that you would push. I can see how that would happen. It was awkward and desirable predicament, and if Johnson had not been present or possessed of real pluck, he might have done all manner of foolish things. As it was, however, he pulled himself together and groped furiously for a little brass knob that turned the light on again, hoping and closing. Oh, let's see, furiously turn on the light again, but rapping, closing the knob, set the coats aside on its swinging, and the fingers across the tangling of the confusion and sleeves of the pockets, so that it was some moments before he found the switch. In those few moments, in bewilderment and terror, 2 things happened that sent him the recall over the boundary into the reason of the genuine horror. He distinctly heard the kit bag shuffling heavily across the floor, and jerks, and close in front of his face sounded once again the sigh of a human being. In his anguish forward to find brass buttons on the wall, he nearly snapped his nails from his fingers in front of them. In those frenzied moments of alarm, so swift and alert were the impressions of a man, key-eyed to the vivid emotion, he had time to realize that he dreaded to return the light, and that it might better him to stay hidden in the merciful screen of darkness. It might be an impulse of a moment. However, he had time to act upon it. He yielded automatically by the original desire in the room, and he looked, and again with light, but the second before the right, he could hear. It would have been better for him to have stayed in the shelter, a kind of darkness, for there, close to him, bending over the half-pocketed kit bag, clear to his life of merciless glare of electric light, stood a figure of John Turk, the murderer. There, 3 feet in front of him, the man stood, fringe and black hair marked plainly against a pillar of his forehead. The whole horrible presentant of the sounded of the vivid had seen him day after day in the Old Bailey, when he stood there in the dock, cynical of the callous, around the very shadow of the gallows. In the flash, John realized what it all meant. The dirty and the much used bag to smear the crimson from the top. The dead was stretched and condemned from the bulging sides. He remembered the victim's body had been stuffed into a canvas bag near the burial of the ghastly, dismembered fragments forced with lime into the very bag. The bag itself produced as evidence, and it all came back to him as clear as day. Very slowly and stealthily, his hand grabbed behind him for the handle of the door, but behind him he could actually turn the very thing that most of all dreaded to come out. And John Turk, his devil face, looked at him at the moment, and the heavy sigh passed through the air in the room, formulated somehow into words in its bag. And I want it. John remembered clawing the door open and falling into a heap onto the landing as he tried frantically to make his way into the front room. He remained unconscious for some time, and it was dark when he opened his eyes and realized that he was lying stiff and bruised on the cold boards, and the memory of what he had seen rushed back into his mind. He promptly fainted again. When he woke the second time, in the wintry dawn was just beginning to peep into the windows, the painting of the stairs, and the cheerless dismay. And he managed to crawl into the front door and cover himself with an overcoat in the chair, where at length he fell asleep. A great clamor woke him. He encouraged Mrs. Monk's voice, loud and voluble. "What, you ain't been to bed, sir? And are you ill, or has you anything happened? Is there any urgent gentleman to see you? Though it ain't 7 o'clock yet. Who is it?" He stammered. "Tim, all right, thanks. Fall asleep in my chair, I suppose. Something to Mr. Wilbraham's." And he He ought to think you quick before you go to bed. He ought to thank you quick before you go to bed, I told him. Show him up, please, at once, said Mr. Johnson, whose head was whirling and his mind was still full of dreadful visions. Mr. Wilbraham's man came with many apologies and explained briefly and quickly and absurdly mistaken had been made. An absurd mistake had been made, and that wrong kit bag had been sent over before. Yeah, no kidding. Somehow he got the one that came over from the courtroom, but Mr. Williams only discovered it when he saw his own laying in the room, and he asked if it had not gone to you. The man said, "It must have brought you one from the murder case instead, sir." I'm afraid, the man continued, without the ghost of an expression on his face. The one Jack Turk packed his dead both in. Mr. Williams awful upset about it, sir. I and told me come over first thing in the morning with the right one as you lay leaving on my boat. He pointed to a clean-looking kit bag on the floor, which he had just bought, and I was bringing the other one back, he added cautiously. For some minutes, John could not find his voice. At last, he pointed to the direction of the bedroom. Perhaps it would kindly unpack it for me. Just empty the things on the floor. The man disappeared into the room, and he had gone for a few minutes. Johnson heard shifting to and fro in the bag and rattling in the skates and boots being unlocked. "Thank you, sir," the man said, returning with the bag folded under his arm. And can I do anything for you, sir?" "What's that?" Johnson said, still seeing that he still had something he wished to say. The man shuffled the words most mysterious. "Beg pardon, sir?" Not knowing interest in Turk case, "I thought you maybe like to know what's going on." "Yes, John Turk killed himself last night with a poison immunity on getting his release, and he left a note with Mr. Wilbraham saying that he'd much be obliged if they'd have him put away the same as the woman he murdered in that old kit bag." "This time, did you see him?" asked Johnson. 10 o'clock last night, sir," the wanderer says. That is the end. Very chilly story. I like it. Murder, intrigue, haunted bags. Makes you wonder. The second-hand clothes that you buy. The second-hand cars or shoes, furniture, beds, couches. What energies do they carry with them? Who was the last to touch them? Who was the last owner to sleep on them or lay in them? Did somebody die on that couch? Is their spirit still attached? Food for thought, my friends. Food for thought. Antiques are known to carry spirits. So, as we embark through this wonderful month of December to the winter solstice of December 21st, through Krampusnacht, to the blessed day of December 25th, the birth of our Savior Jesus Christ. Let's enjoy our family and friends, build memories, laugh, love, enjoy their company. And come back to Joe Motion Videos 82 for a good fright on Fridays for a very merry, scary Christmas. Vampire would love to hear these. So anyway, thank you very much for tuning in. I do appreciate you guys. Look forward to doing this every year as well. We'll see you next year. Happy holidays, everyone. Stay well, stay safe. Remember, with cold flu season, stay healthy. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. That helps the channel out immensely, gets the word out, helps spread the news of this channel. I'm not asking you to do that to inflate my ego. I'm asking you to please do it as a favor to get this channel to grow, to get the word out, spread the news. So anyway, thank you, my friends. I do really appreciate each and every one of you. Take care. Remember, be kind to yourselves, your animals, and everyone around you. You never know what kind of day everyone is having. Bye-bye.